Night was approaching. I didn't want to be caught on the ridge in the dark, exposed and wet, with no idea how to descend. I found a slightly wider patch of rock, flat enough to sit on. I set my pack down, pulled out my emergency poncho, and tried to create a small barrier against the wind and rain. I ate a granola bar, sipped water, and forced myself to stay calm. I checked my compass repeatedly, trying to figure out which direction would lead me to a safer, lower trail. The ridge seemed endless, and the fog and darkness were pressing in like a wall. Hours passed slowly. The rain eased slightly, and I decided I had to move. I knew staying put could be dangerous if the ridge shifted or if hypothermia set in. I followed my compass, picking a direction that seemed to slope downward. The terrain was unforgiving. Slippery rocks, tangled roots, and sudden drops. I moved inch by inch, constantly testing every step, my body screaming with fatigue. My hands were raw from gripping stones, my knees sore from constant bending. I was soaked, cold, and exhausted, but I forced myself forward. Somewhere in the darkness, I heard it again. A low crunch, a sound like rocks or branches moving under weight. I froze. My first thought was an animal, but the sound was too heavy, deliberate. I remembered reading about people lost in the wilderness encountering hunters or other hikers, and my stomach tightened. I moved cautiously, using a fallen tree as a shield and scanning the shadows. But the fog and night made everything look like a shadow, everything a potential threat. I reminded myself that my goal was simple: get down, stay alive. By midnight, I was almost sure I had gone off any recognizable trail. The ridge had leveled out slightly, giving me more space to move, but I was completely disoriented. Every time I thought I could see a slope downward, the terrain would twist again. My legs were heavy, my back aching from the pack, and my stomach hollow from nervous energy and lack of real food. I stopped briefly, leaning against a tree, and realized how dire the situation had become. I was wet, cold, and alone in the dark, with no real idea of where I was or which direction led to safety. I remembered the basics of survival: stay calm, conserve energy, maintain warmth, and move when necessary. I wrapped myself tightly in the poncho, pressed my pack against my chest to retain heat, and tried to trace the contour of the land with my hands. I moved slowly, feeling for the slope, listening to the drip of rain and the rustle of trees, trying to avoid sudden drops. I followed the compass as best as I could, zigzagging downward whenever the land allowed. Every step was careful, deliberate. I forced myself to keep moving, telling myself that giving up was not an option. Finally, as the first hints of dawn began to glow in the sky, I noticed a faint line of lighter gray through the fog. It was a narrow dirt path, slightly clearer than the surrounding forest floor. Relief flooded through me. I crawled toward it, then stood and followed it slowly, testing each step. The trail was old and poorly maintained, but it was a trail. I kept my pace slow, my boots slipping in the wet soil, my hands scraping against wet branches and roots. By mid-morning, the fog had lifted slightly, revealing more of the forest. The path widened and sloped downward consistently. I began to recognize landmarks from my map: an unusual bend in the creek, a large boulder shaped like a crude triangle, a fallen log spanning a small ravine. I followed the trail carefully, exhausted but steady. My body ached in every joint, but my mind had regained focus. I could see the parking area in the distance, small figures of cars and the muted glint of sunlight on metal. When I finally reached the trailhead, I collapsed onto a bench, soaked, muddy, and shivering. I had no one to greet me, no one to check on me, just the sound of the forest slowly waking and the distant hum of a highway. I emptied my pack, wrung out my clothes, and drank deeply from my water bottle. The relief was overwhelming. I realized I had made mistakes. Overconfidence, poor route choices, underestimating the ridge, ignoring signs of fatigue. But I had survived, and that knowledge burned itself into my mind. I left the forest carefully, driving home slowly, every muscle sore, every sense alert to movement or sound. I didn't rush. The experience had taught me humility and respect for the wilderness. lessons I would carry for the rest of my life. I had faced fear that was tangible, real, and unrelenting. I had faced exhaustion, disorientation, cold, and the possibility of injury or worse. But I survived, and I emerged wiser, more cautious, and deeply aware of the fine line between adventure and danger. That hike remained with me for years. I studied maps differently, checked weather more meticulously, and always respected the limits of my body and the landscape. I learned to read the forest with careful attention, to listen to subtle changes in terrain, weather, and sound. The ridge that had almost claimed me became a memory of endurance, a reminder that survival depended on preparation, awareness, and the will to keep moving even when everything in me screamed to stop. I never returned to that ridge, but I never forgot it. And every time I went hiking afterward, I carried with me not just water and gear, but a deep, visceral respect for the power of the wilderness and the thin line that separates safety from danger. I had planned this hike for months, mapping out the trails, checking weather reports, packing every piece of gear I thought I might need, and studying topographic maps until I could trace every contour line with my eyes. I was alone, but I liked it that way. Solitude on the trail cleared my mind, and I trusted myself to handle the woods better than anyone else. I was confident, maybe too confident. The trailhead was quiet when I arrived early that morning. Mist lingered among the pines, and the air smelled of wet earth and pine needles. The mountains rose ahead, jagged and dark against the pale gray sky. My pack was heavy but manageable, stuffed with water, food, first aid supplies, extra clothes, and my trusty old map and compass. I double-checked everything before stepping onto the narrow dirt path that wound up the ridge. The first few hours were peaceful. Birds called overhead, the soil was soft under my boots, and the incline was steady but not exhausting. The fog was thicker as I climbed, muffling sounds and turning the familiar forest into a gray haze where shapes appeared and disappeared with every step. I knew these trails, but the fog made everything feel alien, as though the forest was holding its breath. I kept my pace steady, taking short breaks, sipping water, checking my bearings. I had no reason to worry. The trail was marked, and I had a map. I reminded myself of that whenever the fog seemed to thicken or the forest felt too quiet. By mid-morning, I reached a fork I didn't remember seeing on the map. The markers were old, nearly faded, and I hesitated. One path climbed steeply to the ridge, while the other curved downward into a narrow valley. The ridge trail was harder but more direct, while the valley seemed safer but longer. I chose the ridge, thinking I could handle the incline and that the views would be worth it. It was a decision I would regret. The slope was steeper than I expected, loose gravel under my boots making every step a careful negotiation. The fog clung to the mountainside, dampening my clothes and chilling my skin. I kept moving, telling myself it was just a little hard, that this was what hiking was. Hours passed, and the trail became less obvious. Rocks jutted out of the ground at sharp angles, roots tangled across the path, and the incline grew nearly vertical in places. My legs burned with the effort, my lungs worked harder with each step, and the fog thickened until I could barely see a few feet ahead. I tried to stay calm, told myself I had the map and compass. But the more I climbed, the less familiar everything became. The ridge stretched endlessly, and the forest around me was a gray blur. I paused often, trying to catch glimpses of landmarks, trying to orient myself. My confidence started to falter. Around midday, I realized I had made a mistake. The path I thought was a marked trail was barely a trail at all. Rocks and brush forced me to slow to a crawl, and the fog was so thick I couldn't see the next marker, even if it existed. I began to worry. The isolation, which I had cherished at first, now felt oppressive. The silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant snap of a branch. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow made me tense. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears as I climbed over boulders and pushed through brush. My sense of direction began to falter. I stopped and set my pack down on a flat rock, breathing heavily. I took out my map and compass, trying to orient myself. But the fog and my exhaustion were working together to confuse me. The landmarks I tried to match with the map didn't align. The lines of the trail blurred in my memory, and I realized I might have missed a junction. Panic crept in, subtle at first, then stronger. I tried to force calm, telling myself that I had water, food, and a compass. But even the compass didn't help when the trees and fog erased every reference point. The forest seemed endless, a gray world of shapes and shadows. I decided to climb higher, hoping the ridge would open into clearer terrain, where I could see other landmarks. Every step was harder than the last. My legs were heavy, my boots slippery on loose stones, my arms sore from gripping rocks to pull myself up. The ridge narrowed in places, sharp drops to one side, thick brush on the other. I had to be careful with every movement. One wrong step, one slip, and I could have fallen. My confidence was gone. I was no longer enjoying the solitude. I was alert, tense, and afraid. By late afternoon, I realized the sun had not broken through the clouds, and the fog was turning into drizzle. My clothes were wet, my pack heavier with moisture, and the wind began to whip along the ridge. The temperature dropped quickly. I shivered despite my layers, trying to keep moving to generate heat. Every step was a mental effort. I could feel my hands trembling, gripping the rocks for balance. I knew I needed to find shelter soon, but there was nothing. No overhang, no cabin, no flat ground to set up a tent. The ridge was cruel, exposed, and slippery. Then, I heard it. A low rumble far below, the sound of rocks shifting. My first thought was a small landslide, but the sound echoed strangely in the fog. I froze, listening. The rumble came again, slower this time, closer. My heart pounded. I knew the ridge above me was unstable. Rocks could slide. A misstep could send me tumbling down hundreds of feet. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios. I had to move, but carefully. I started descending along the narrow ridge, testing each foothold before committing my weight. Hours passed. The fog never lifted. The drizzle turned into steady rain, and the rocks became slick. My gloves were soaked, my fingers stiff with cold. My boots squelched in mud and moss, slipping on stones that had seemed stable moments before. I had no idea where the trail continued or if it even existed anymore. Panic returned in waves, but I forced myself to slow my breathing and think. I kept looking for markers, listening for signs of other hikers or human activity. Nothing, just wind, rain, and the sound of my own movements. I had been planning this solo hike for months. The trail I chose was not one of the crowded, popular ones that hikers often boast about. It was a narrow, winding path through a remote stretch of the Cascades, a trail that only a few knew about. I wanted solitude, the kind that forces you to focus on every step, every sound, every breath. I packed lightly but thoroughly. A sturdy backpack, water filtration system, food for 3 days, a first aid kit, headlamp, compass, and a map I had studied repeatedly. My boots were worn in but solid, the kind that would grip the mossy rocks and mud without slipping. The morning I left, the air was crisp, cold enough to make my breath visible with each exhale. The forest smelled damp, a mix of pine, wet soil, and decaying leaves. I started early, wanting to make the most of the daylight. The first few hours were exhilarating. The trail twisted along steep ridges and gentle valleys. Birds flitted through the canopy, and somewhere in the distance, a river gurgled over stones. I kept a steady pace, careful not to trip on exposed roots or loose rocks. By mid-morning, the path narrowed, and I noticed how quiet it had become. Not the peaceful quiet of a forest, but a kind of pressing silence, heavy and expectant. I shrugged it off, attributing it to being away from any other hikers. Still, I felt my senses sharpening, every rustle of leaves or snap of twigs causing me to pause, heart tightening. I reminded myself that animals were the only creatures here and that most were harmless. Yet the thought that I was alone in such a vast, uninhabited stretch of forest made my stomach twist in a subtle anxiety I could not shake. The trail became steeper in the afternoon. My legs ached, and sweat soaked my shirt, cooling quickly in the brisk air. I stopped to drink water and check the map. According to my calculations, I should reach a small plateau with a good campsite in a few hours. But as I looked up, I noticed the sky had begun to darken in ways I hadn't expected. The sun was still visible behind thick clouds, but they rolled fast, low, and ominous. The wind picked up, rustling the treetops with a persistent whisper. I pushed forward. The forest floor grew treacherous, covered with slick moss and loose gravel. At one point, I slipped slightly on a steep incline, my hands scraping against a jagged rock. The cut was shallow, but the sting brought my attention fully to the immediate danger. I slowed, breathing hard, feeling the tension in my shoulders. Around me, the forest seemed to hold its breath. Every sound, the caw of a crow, the distant rush of water, felt amplified. I told myself I had prepared for this. I was careful, I was alert, and I knew these woods. But a knot of unease had settled in my chest. By late afternoon, I reached the ridge leading to the plateau. From here, the view was breathtaking. I could see the valley far below, a patchwork of trees and rivers, fading into blue haze in the distance. But I also saw what I hadn't noticed before. The sheer drop-off to my left, jagged rocks that could be fatal if I slipped. I set down my pack and rested, trying to shake the tension building inside me. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear, not exactly, but from the strain of concentration and exertion. I ate a protein bar and drank, letting the quiet stretch around me. Then I heard it, a snapping of branches somewhere below, closer than I expected. I froze, straining to locate it. The forest was dense, visibility limited. I could see nothing moving among the trees, yet the sound repeated, deliberate. Snap, pause, snap. My pulse jumped. I told myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon, something natural and not worth worrying about. But the sound was different from a normal animal. It had weight behind it, like something larger, something aware. I checked my pack. I had my flashlight, my knife, and a small emergency whistle. I kept moving slowly, carefully, keeping my eyes on the path and listening for any follow-up sound. As I descended toward the campsite, the snapping grew more frequent. I tried to rationalize. Maybe the wind had loosened branches, or maybe I had imagined it. But when I stepped over a fallen log, I caught movement, a shadow darting behind a tree. I stopped dead. My heart thudded painfully. My mind raced through the possibilities. Another hiker, lost or curious. An animal larger than a deer, maybe a bear. I gripped my knife, feeling the leather of its handle cold and solid in my hand. The forest around me seemed suddenly alive, each tree a potential hiding spot, each rustle a threat. I reached the plateau just as the light began to fade. My chosen campsite was small but sheltered, nestled between rocky outcrops and a copse of pine. I set up my tent quickly, hands shaking slightly, double-checking every peg and cord. I stacked a small fire pit from rocks and collected dry twigs for firewood, though the wind made me hesitant. As I worked, the snapping sounds continued, now higher up the slope, circling around me in a way that felt intentional. I was alone, yet I felt watched. Night fell, colder and darker than I expected. I lit a small fire, the flames casting a warm circle around my tent. I ate my remaining food, drank water, and tried to calm my mind. The forest at night was terrifyingly silent, punctuated only by the occasional snap, creak, or distant animal cry. I reminded myself constantly, I was prepared. I had survival skills, training, and the right gear. But even that logic didn't dispel the tension threading through every nerve. Hours passed. I dozed lightly, waking every few minutes at the slightest sound. A branch snapped closer. A rock tumbled down the slope. Every sound felt amplified, threatening. I kept my flashlight and knife within reach. Then I heard it unmistakably. A low growl, deep, deliberate, coming from the ridge above. My stomach tightened. A bear was possible, I reminded myself, but I had kept food sealed and away from the tent. Still, the sound had weight, a presence that made the hairs on my neck stand. I stayed still, careful not to make any noise, listening. It circled above me, moving from tree to tree. I could feel its awareness, the way it acknowledged my presence without yet committing. Hours seemed to stretch like days. I waited, too tense to sleep, too alert to rest. Then the growling stopped, leaving only silence. I dared not move until the faintest glimmer of pre-dawn light appeared. When morning came, I cautiously emerged from my tent. The forest was calm again, the shadows long and soft. Nothing seemed disturbed, yet the ground bore signs. Broken twigs, footprints that were larger than mine, and scratch marks on nearby trees. I packed up quickly, leaving the fire pit cold and the site as undisturbed as I could. Every step back along the trail was deliberate, careful, but I kept moving. The ridge loomed above, and I kept scanning it, half expecting to see movement. By mid-morning, I reached a flatter section of trail, one I recognized from my map. Relief surged through me. The snapping and growls of the previous night seemed distant, almost unreal in the daylight. I stopped to drink water, letting the sun warm my wet shirt and chilled skin. I reminded myself repeatedly, I was fine. I had survived the night. I had stayed alert, followed safety protocols, and had not taken unnecessary risks. When I finally exited the forest trail and reached a small ranger station at the trailhead, I felt a rush of relief I had never known on any other hike. The ranger gave me a friendly nod as I signed in, noting the time of return. I thanked him silently in my head, grateful for the structure of human presence after the raw, isolated wilderness. I had survived alone, careful and vigilant, without incident escalating to injury or disaster. Later, reflecting on the experience, I realized how easily a misstep could have turned the night into a tragedy. A sprained ankle, a misjudged step near the ridge, or a less cautious response to the bear's presence could have been fatal. But I had relied on preparation, observation, and discipline. That night in the forest had been frightening, tense, and exhausting. Yet I emerged stronger, more aware, and profoundly respectful of the wild. The memory of those hours, the quiet, the shadows, the low growls, remained vivid, a reminder of how thin the line can be between adventure and danger, and how preparation and caution are the best allies in facing the wilderness alone. I had been planning this solo hike for months. The trail I chose was not one of the crowded, popular ones that hikers often boast about. It was a narrow, winding path through a remote stretch of the Cascades, a trail that only a few knew about. I wanted solitude, the kind that forces you to focus on every step, every sound, every breath. I packed lightly but thoroughly. A sturdy backpack, water filtration system, food for 3 days, a first aid kit, headlamp, compass, and a map I had studied repeatedly. My boots were worn in but solid, the kind that would grip the mossy rocks and mud without slipping. The morning I left, the air was crisp, cold enough to make my breath visible with each exhale. The forest smelled damp, a mix of pine, wet soil, and decaying leaves. I started early, wanting to make the most of the daylight. The first few hours were exhilarating. The trail twisted along steep ridges and gentle valleys. Birds flitted through the canopy, and somewhere in the distance, a river gurgled over stones. I kept a steady pace, careful not to trip on exposed roots or loose rocks. By mid-morning, the path narrowed, and I noticed how quiet it had become. Not the peaceful quiet of a forest, but a kind of pressing silence, heavy and expectant. I shrugged it off, attributing it to being away from any other hikers. Still, I felt my senses sharpening, every rustle of leaves or snap of twigs causing me to pause, heart tightening. I reminded myself that animals were the only creatures here and that most were harmless. Yet the thought that I was alone in such a vast, uninhabited stretch of forest made my stomach twist in a subtle anxiety I could not shake. The trail became steeper in the afternoon. My legs ached, and sweat soaked my shirt, cooling quickly in the brisk air. I stopped to drink water and check the map. According to my calculations, I should reach a small plateau with a good campsite in a few hours. But as I looked up, I noticed the sky had begun to darken in ways I hadn't expected. The sun was still visible behind thick clouds, but they rolled fast, low, and ominous. The wind picked up, rustling the treetops with a persistent whisper. I pushed forward. The forest floor grew treacherous, covered with slick moss and loose gravel. At one point, I slipped slightly on a steep incline, my hands scraping against a jagged rock. The cut was shallow, but the sting brought my attention fully to the immediate danger. I slowed, breathing hard, feeling the tension in my shoulders. Around me, the forest seemed to hold its breath. Every sound, the caw of a crow, the distant rush of water, felt amplified. I told myself I had prepared for this. I was careful, I was alert, and I knew these woods. But a knot of unease had settled in my chest. By late afternoon, I reached the ridge leading to the plateau. From here, the view was breathtaking. I could see the valley far below, a patchwork of trees and rivers, fading into blue haze in the distance. But I also saw what I hadn't noticed before. The sheer drop-off to my left, jagged rocks that could be fatal if I slipped. I set down my pack and rested, trying to shake the tension building inside me. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear, not exactly, but from the strain of concentration and exertion. I ate a protein bar and drank, letting the quiet stretch around me. Then I heard it, a snapping of branches somewhere below, closer than I expected. I froze, straining to locate it. The forest was dense, visibility limited. I could see nothing moving among the trees, yet the sound repeated, deliberate. Snap, pause, snap. My pulse jumped. I told myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon, something natural and not worth worrying about. But the sound was different from a normal animal. It had weight behind it, like something larger, something aware. I checked my pack. I had my flashlight, my knife, and a small emergency whistle. I kept moving slowly, carefully, keeping my eyes on the path and listening for any follow-up sound. As I descended toward the campsite, the snapping grew more frequent. I tried to rationalize. Maybe the wind had loosened branches, or maybe I had imagined it. But when I stepped over a fallen log, I caught movement, a shadow darting behind a tree. I stopped dead. My heart thudded painfully. My mind raced through the possibilities. Another hiker, lost or curious. An animal larger than a deer, maybe a bear. I gripped my knife, feeling the leather of its handle cold and solid in my hand. The forest around me seemed suddenly alive, each tree a potential hiding spot, each rustle a threat. I reached the plateau just as the light began to fade. My chosen campsite was small but sheltered, nestled between rocky outcrops and a copse of pine. I set up my tent quickly, hands shaking slightly, double-checking every peg and cord. I stacked a small fire pit from rocks and collected dry twigs for firewood, though the wind made me hesitant. As I worked, the snapping sounds continued, now higher up the slope, circling around me in a way that felt intentional. I was alone, yet I felt watched. Night fell, colder and darker than I expected. I lit a small fire, the flames casting a warm circle around my tent. I ate my remaining food, drank water, and tried to calm my mind. The forest at night was terrifyingly silent, punctuated only by the occasional snap, creak, or distant animal cry. I reminded myself constantly, I was prepared. I had survival skills, training, and the right gear. But even that logic didn't dispel the tension threading through every nerve. Hours passed. I dozed lightly, waking every few minutes at the slightest sound. A branch snapped closer. A rock tumbled down the slope. Every sound felt amplified, threatening. I kept my flashlight and knife within reach. Then I heard it unmistakably. A low growl, deep, deliberate, coming from the ridge above. My stomach tightened. A bear was possible, I reminded myself, but I had kept food sealed and away from the tent. Still, the sound had weight, a presence that made the hairs on my neck stand. I stayed still, careful not to make any noise, listening. It circled above me, moving from tree to tree. I could feel its awareness, the way it acknowledged my presence without yet committing. Hours seemed to stretch like days. I waited, too tense to sleep, too alert to rest. Then the growling stopped, leaving only silence. I dared not move until the faintest glimmer of pre-dawn light appeared. When morning came, I cautiously emerged from my tent. The forest was calm again, the shadows long and soft. Nothing seemed disturbed, yet the ground bore signs. Broken twigs, footprints that were larger than mine, and scratch marks on nearby trees. I packed up quickly, leaving the fire pit cold and the site as undisturbed as I could. Every step back along the trail was deliberate, careful, but I kept moving. The ridge loomed above, and I kept scanning it, half expecting to see movement. By mid-morning, I reached a flatter section of trail, one I recognized from my map. Relief surged through me. The snapping and growls of the previous night seemed distant, almost unreal in the daylight. I stopped to drink water, letting the sun warm my wet shirt and chilled skin. I reminded myself repeatedly, I was fine. I had survived the night. I had stayed alert, followed safety protocols, and had not taken unnecessary risks. When I finally exited the forest trail and reached a small ranger station at the trailhead, I felt a rush of relief I had never known on any other hike. The ranger gave me a friendly nod as I signed in, noting the time of return. I thanked him silently in my head, grateful for the structure of human presence after the raw, isolated wilderness. I had survived alone, careful and vigilant, without incident escalating to injury or disaster. Later, reflecting on the experience, I realized how easily a misstep could have turned the night into a tragedy. A sprained ankle, a misjudged step near the ridge, or a less cautious response to the bear's presence could have been fatal. But I had relied on preparation, observation, and discipline. That night in the forest had been frightening, tense, and exhausting. Yet I emerged stronger, more aware, and profoundly respectful of the wild. The memory of those hours, the quiet, the shadows, the low growls, remained vivid, a reminder of how thin the line can be between adventure and danger, and how preparation and caution are the best allies in facing the wilderness alone. As I rounded a bend, the ridge dropped sharply to the left. I had to navigate a section barely wide enough for my boots. One hand pressed against a rock wall, the other gripping my trekking pole. My mind was entirely on each step, on the uneven rocks, on the loose gravel underfoot. I felt the fear coil in my chest. It was real, physical, almost paralyzing, but I forced myself to keep moving. Suddenly, the ground beneath me shifted. A small section of the trail gave way. My left foot slipped, and I stumbled, my heart leaping. I grabbed a jagged rock with my hand, scraping my palm, but it held. I froze, my breath coming in short, ragged bursts. For a moment, I thought I might fall entirely. The slope below was unforgiving, jagged rocks waiting like teeth. My mind raced through every possible outcome. I forced myself to calm down. Step by careful step, I tested the ridge ahead. Some rocks were loose, some seemed stable. I made slow progress, each movement deliberate. I could feel the tension in every muscle, the strain in my arms and legs. My heart pounded so loudly I thought it might be heard over the valley below. I couldn't turn back. The path behind me was treacherous, too, and the rocks had shifted from the small slides. Moving forward was the only safe option. Hours passed, though I wasn't sure exactly how long. The sun dropped lower, turning the valley into a patchwork of shadows. I kept moving, using the last light to navigate the rocks. My water was running low, my legs were sore, and the fear never let go. Every sound, branches snapping, rocks shifting, wind rustling through the trees, made my stomach tighten. I had to keep calm. Panic would get me killed. Finally, the ridge began to widen. The trail became more stable, the drops less severe. My pace slowed, my body trembling from exhaustion, but I knew I was approaching safer ground. I focused on each step, watching where I placed my feet, avoiding loose rocks and slippery patches. My hands were scraped and dirty, my clothes stained with dirt and sweat. I could feel the ache in every joint, but I forced myself to keep moving, driven by the knowledge that I was close to safety. Eventually, I reached a flatter section of trail. Trees thickened around me, providing cover and support. The ground was solid, the path clearly marked. Relief flooded through me, though I stayed alert. I checked my map again. I was near the end of the ridge section, approaching a junction where I could descend safely to the valley below. My legs were weak, my hands sore, but I moved carefully down the path, my pace slow but steady. As I descended, the sun dipped behind the mountains, leaving a dusky glow in the sky. I kept moving, counting each step, focusing on the ground ahead. The path leveled out, rocks gave way to soil, and the trees thinned. I could hear the distant sound of a creek, water running over stones. The smell of damp earth and pine filled my nostrils, grounding me. I kept walking, knowing that with each step I was moving further from danger, further from the ridge that had nearly killed me. By the time I reached the bottom, night had fully settled. I followed the trail toward a small ranger cabin I had noted on the map, the only shelter in the area. My legs were shaking, my body aching, but I kept moving. The cabin was small, simple, and abandoned, but it provided a sense of security. I set my pack down and sat against the wall, letting myself rest. My heart gradually slowed, though the adrenaline lingered. I stayed in the cabin until morning. I rationed my remaining water and food, checked my gear, and prepared for the final stretch back to the main trailhead. When I left, the forest seemed less threatening. I kept my eyes on the path, but the fear that had clung to me on the ridge had faded. I moved carefully, step by step, but with confidence now that I was past the most dangerous part. By midday, I emerged from the highlands onto a dirt road that led back to civilization. Cars passed by occasionally, and the sounds of people and life were like balm after the tension of the last day. I walked the road until I reached the nearest town, exhausted but safe. I called someone to let them know I was okay. The fear, the adrenaline, the sheer terror of the ridge, they remained in my mind, vivid, but tempered by relief. Looking back, I realized I had underestimated the trail, underestimated the isolation and danger. But I had survived, step by careful step, relying on my attention, my caution, and my persistence. The ridge had tested me in ways I never expected, and I had made it through. I walked away with a deep respect for the mountains, the terrain, and the raw unpredictability of nature. The experience stayed with me, a memory of fear and survival, but also of endurance and careful judgment. I knew I would hike again, but never without preparation, and never without respect for the trail. I had been planning this hike for months. I wanted to escape the city for a while, to be somewhere quiet, somewhere where I could feel the ground beneath my feet and hear my own thoughts without the constant buzz of cars and people. I picked a trail that cut through the highlands, a place known for its rugged terrain and sparse population. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, because I didn't want advice or worry or someone trying to change my mind. I just needed to go. The morning I left, the air was crisp, a little colder than I expected, but refreshing. I loaded my pack carefully: water, food, first aid, a flashlight, a map, and a compass. I wore sturdy boots, thick socks, and layers I could peel off or add as the day progressed. The trail started at a small parking lot beside an old ranger station that looked abandoned. I noticed the paint was peeling, the windows dusty and cracked, but the sign was still readable: Highland Ridge Trail. I took a deep breath, tightened my backpack, and started walking. At first, everything seemed ordinary. The sun was rising, painting the trees gold and orange. Birds chirped in the underbrush, and a few squirrels scurried along the trunks. I moved steadily, watching the trail wind up the ridge. It was harder than I expected. The incline was steep, and my legs burned, but the air was clean and sharp. I kept a steady pace, stopping occasionally to take sips of water and look at the valley below. About 3 hours in, I noticed the trail narrowing. The trees grew thicker, the branches brushing my arms as I pushed past them. The ground was damp, and my boots sank slightly into the soft earth. It was beautiful, in a wild, untamed way, but I started to notice something unsettling. The silence. The birds had stopped singing. Even the wind seemed to have died down. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just a quiet moment. I kept walking. That's when I noticed something else. Footprints. Not animal footprints, these were human. They were muddied and fresh, but only a few. as if someone had walked the trail slowly. I paused, looking around. There was no one in sight. My stomach tightened, a little warning flickering in the back of my mind. But the trail was isolated. People didn't come here often. I convinced myself they were hikers who had passed earlier, or maybe someone who had camped nearby. Still, I kept my eyes open. By mid-afternoon, I reached a clearing. The view was breathtaking. The valley stretched out beneath me, dotted with patches of mist rising from the lowlands. I set my pack down and took a long drink of water, my legs aching from the climb. I checked my map. The next stretch of trail would take me along a narrow ridge. The path would be exposed, with steep drops on either side. I felt a thrill mixed with a deep, quiet fear. Height and isolation always did that to me. I started along the ridge. At first, it was manageable, the trail just barely wide enough for a single foot in some places. I had to concentrate on each step, balancing carefully. The air was colder up here, sharper. My breathing became heavier, my heartbeat louder in my ears. Then I noticed something I hadn't expected. The trail ahead looked disturbed, almost broken. Rocks had shifted, dirt was loose, and there were signs of small landslides. The trail looked unstable, dangerous. I considered turning back, but something pushed me forward. Maybe it was stubbornness, maybe curiosity, maybe a quiet need to prove I could do it. Step by step, I moved along the ridge, testing each foot placement carefully. One wrong move could mean falling several feet down the slope. I tried not to think about it, but it was impossible to ignore entirely. Every step required attention, a careful balance between courage and caution. Halfway along the ridge, I heard it. A sound, soft but definite. A crack of something breaking under weight. I froze. My eyes darted around. There was no one in sight. The sound repeated, but this time it was behind me, higher up the ridge. I swallowed, my throat dry. Could have been a falling branch. Could have been nothing. But something in my gut told me it was someone or something nearby. I kept moving, faster now, but cautiously. The ridge narrowed further, and loose rocks shifted under my boots. One slip, one misplaced step, and I could tumble down the steep side. I focused entirely on the trail, blocking out the strange noises behind me. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things. Hikers didn't usually come this far alone, not this time of year. Still, the sense of being watched clung to me. I had been planning this hike for months, carefully mapping out the trails, checking the weather, and gathering all the supplies I thought I would need. I wanted to go into the backcountry alone, something that I had never done before, and something that I thought would test my endurance and my ability to navigate on my own. The forest I was heading into was known for its rugged terrain, steep inclines, and dense underbrush. I had studied maps and photographs of the area for weeks, noting the points where water could be found and marking safe places to rest or camp overnight. I packed light but thoroughly: tent, sleeping bag, water filter, extra food, a first aid kit, a compass, maps, and even some basic climbing gear in case I needed it. I made sure my boots were broken in, my backpack fit well, and I had extra socks and clothes for the nights, which I knew could get very cold. The morning of my departure was overcast but dry. The clouds hung low in the sky, thick and gray, casting a muted light over the forest. The air smelled fresh and damp, a mixture of pine and earth that made my lungs feel clear and heavy at the same time. I started early, moving at a brisk pace through the lower trails, the ground uneven beneath my boots. Roots jutted out at odd angles, forcing me to pay attention to each step, and rocks were slick with moisture from the previous night's rain. I kept checking my compass and the map, making sure I was on the right path, though I had memorized the first stretch and felt confident. The forest was quiet, not the kind of quiet that made you uncomfortable, but the kind that made you aware of everything at once. The rustle of leaves high in the trees, the snap of twigs beneath my feet, the distant drip of water from branches. It all combined into a symphony of subtle sounds that I could almost feel in my chest. I moved carefully, breathing evenly, my heart steady. I had always loved hiking, but this time, there was a different intensity. Alone, I had to trust myself completely, and I felt a strange mixture of excitement and apprehension. After several hours, I reached the first incline, a steep climb that required me to use my hands for balance in some spots. The air grew cooler as I gained elevation, and a light fog began to roll in, thickening around the trunks of the trees. Visibility dropped, and the forest seemed to close in around me. I slowed down, taking deliberate steps, placing my feet carefully on wet moss-covered rocks. My pack felt heavier on the incline, each step a reminder of how much effort I had to put in. I took a small break on a large flat rock, eating a granola bar and sipping water. Below me, the forest stretched for miles, the canopy thick and shadowed, the fog curling through it like smoke. I knew that from this point on, I would be entering less traveled paths. The trail markers became sparse, and the path itself narrowed. Branches scratched against my arms and legs as I pushed through, and every now and then, the undergrowth threatened to trip me. I had studied this section in particular. It was known for being isolated, with sudden drops and uneven terrain. The maps showed a small creek that I could use as a reference point. I had planned to follow the creek upstream to find a clearing where I could camp safely for the night. By late afternoon, I reached the creek. The sound of running water was reassuring. I took a moment to rest, filling my water bottles and washing my hands and face in the cold stream. The rocks along the bank were slick, and I had to be careful not to slip. The forest seemed denser here, the trees older, their roots exposed and tangled like thick ropes. The fog had grown heavier, and the light was fading faster than I had expected. I realized that I would need to find a place to camp soon. I followed the creek upstream, scanning for a flat area that was safe and dry. After almost an hour, I found a small clearing surrounded by thick pines. It was not large, but it was enough for my tent and a small fire. The ground was uneven, littered with pine needles and small stones, but it would do. I set up my tent carefully, making sure it was anchored well, then gathered some dry branches for a fire. The process of setting up camp took longer than I anticipated, partly because the light was fading and partly because I was meticulous. I didn't want to make a mistake in the dark. Once my tent was secure and the fire was crackling, I sat on a log nearby, eating a simple meal of dried meat and nuts. The firelight danced on the trees, casting long, shifting shadows. The fog wrapped around the clearing like a thin veil, muffling sounds from deeper in the forest. I felt both comforted and uneasy at the same time. There was a rhythm to the forest, the occasional distant sound of running water, the wind whispering through branches, the soft crackle of my fire. But beneath it all, there was an unpredictability that I could not ignore. As night deepened, the temperature dropped sharply. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up, and tried to sleep. The wind picked up, rattling the tent and shaking branches overhead. I could hear the occasional snap of a branch breaking somewhere in the forest. I reminded myself that I was careful, that I had packed enough food and water, and that I was aware of my surroundings. Still, the isolation pressed against me. The night felt longer than it should have, and sleep was fitful, broken by the sounds of the forest and my own cautious thoughts. The next morning, I woke early, my body sore from the hike and the cold. I packed up my camp slowly, making sure not to leave anything behind and ensuring that I had no issues with my gear. I started hiking again, following the creek and climbing higher into the mountains. The terrain became more rugged, the fog still heavy, making visibility difficult. I relied on my map, compass, and instinct to navigate. Each step required concentration. A single misstep could result in injury. By midday, I had reached a particularly steep section where the trail narrowed along a cliffside. The rock was loose in places, and the slope below was steep and unforgiving. I moved slowly, placing each foot carefully, testing every step before committing my weight. My pack pressed against my back, and my hands found purchase on rough rock and tree roots. The air was thin here, and each breath was deliberate. My muscles burned with effort, but I reminded myself to stay calm and focused. Suddenly, as I was negotiating a particularly tricky patch, I heard a sound behind me. It was soft at first, like a branch snapping, but then louder, closer. My heart raced. I paused, looking back along the trail. The fog was dense, and visibility was almost zero beyond a few feet. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other forest animal, but the sound was heavy, deliberate, and too close for comfort. I checked my surroundings carefully. There were no obvious signs of other hikers, no tracks on the muddy path, nothing that indicated anyone else was there. I continued cautiously, moving faster but still deliberate, keeping my eyes and ears alert. The sound persisted intermittently, distant but present. I reached a small plateau where I could rest briefly. I looked around, trying to determine the source, but the fog and trees concealed everything. I realized that in this terrain, getting lost was easy, and even a small injury could turn serious. I decided to change my route slightly, moving away from the cliffside and toward a denser forest area where the incline was gentler. As I moved through this new path, the forest became darker, the canopy thickening above. The ground was uneven, filled with roots and rocks that threatened to trip me. I had to stop several times to regain my balance and catch my breath. Water from the creek had disappeared, leaving me with only my remaining supply. The fog persisted, clinging to every tree and rock, and the air grew colder. I could feel the damp seeping into my clothes and boots. By late afternoon, I realized I was running low on daylight. I needed to find a place to camp quickly, and the terrain offered few options. I spotted a small depression in the ground surrounded by thick brush. It was not ideal, but it was safe from any cliff edges and somewhat sheltered from the wind. I set up my tent quickly, my hands stiff and trembling from cold and exertion. I gathered whatever dry wood I could find and started a small fire. The process was slow, my fingers numb, but I managed. As I sat by the fire, exhaustion finally hitting me, I considered my situation. I was far from the trailhead, alone, and the forest stretched endlessly around me. I felt a weight in my chest, a mixture of fear and relief. Fear because of the isolation and the unknown, relief because I had managed to navigate this far without incident, and because I had managed to create a small safe zone for the night. That night, sleep came more easily. I was too tired to overthink the forest sounds, too cold to resist the warmth of the fire and sleeping bag. I slept in cycles, waking occasionally to check my fire, to listen to the forest, to ensure I was safe. When dawn came, I packed up methodically, checking my map and compass, and setting a clear route back to the main trailhead. I knew it would take another full day to reach safety, but I was prepared and determined. The hike back was grueling but steady. I moved carefully, retracing my steps where I could, avoiding the cliffside, and navigating through the foggy underbrush. My muscles ached, my feet were blistered, but I kept my focus. I used every skill I had learned from previous hikes: careful observation, slow deliberate steps, and constant awareness of my surroundings. By late afternoon, I saw a familiar landmark, a rock formation near the creek, that assured me I was back on the main trail. Relief washed over me, but I kept moving steadily, knowing that fatigue and carelessness could still lead to injury. By the time I reached the trailhead, the sun was low in the sky. I was covered in dirt and sweat. My backpack felt lighter now, but my body was exhausted. I sat on a large rock for a long time, drinking the last of my water and looking back at the forest. I felt an overwhelming sense of accomplishment and relief. The forest had tested me, had forced me to confront my limits, and had reminded me of the power and unpredictability of nature. I had emerged safely, wiser, and with a deep respect for the wilderness. I left the forest that day not just with memories of the challenge and fear, but with a clear understanding of my own resilience. Every ache, every scrape, every moment of hesitation had taught me something about preparation, focus, and endurance. I knew I would hike again, but I also knew that the forest, in all its beauty and danger, demanded respect. I had survived, and that survival was clear and tangible, a combination of preparation, caution, and perseverance. The memory of that hike remained vivid, etched in my mind, a reminder of the thin line between caution and risk, and the importance of never underestimating the wilderness. I had been planning this solo hike for months, I wanted a real challenge, something far from the crowded trails near the city, something that would test my endurance and survival skills. I had my eye on a stretch of the White Pine Ridge Trail, a remote section that climbed steep, rugged hills and wound through dense forests. It was said to be beautiful but dangerous in the late fall, when weather could shift suddenly and hikers often got lost. I had mapped every section carefully, downloaded offline GPS maps, and packed enough supplies to last me for several days. My backpack was heavy, around 50 pounds, but I had trained for it, hiking shorter trails with weighted packs for weeks beforehand. I started my hike early in the morning. The sun was low, spilling orange light through the bare trees. The air was crisp, almost biting, and the forest smelled damp and earthy. I loved that smell. It made me feel alive. I walked steadily, listening to the crunch of leaves and twigs under my boots. The trail climbed sharply, twisting through dense stands of pine and birch. Every few hundred meters, I had to stop and catch my breath, my lungs burning from the altitude gain. My pack pressed against my shoulders, and my legs ached, but I felt strong and confident. For the first few hours, the trail was relatively easy to follow. Faint tire tracks and old paint blazes guided me through the woods. I passed several small creeks, frozen in patches, and watched as thin layers of ice cracked under the force of the water. Birds darted from branch to branch, their wings flashing white against the dark trunks. Occasionally, I would catch glimpses of deer moving quietly through the underbrush, and once a red fox darted across the trail, pausing briefly before vanishing into the trees. By late morning, the sun had climbed higher, casting dappled shadows across the trail. I stopped for a break near a small clearing, taking off my pack and sitting on a fallen log. I drank water from my bottle and ate a granola bar, surveying the surrounding forest. The trail ahead twisted steeply upward, disappearing behind a ridge. I refilled my water and adjusted my pack, preparing for the most challenging section of the day. As I climbed the ridge, the trail became less distinct. Roots and rocks jutted out of the ground, forcing me to move carefully to avoid twisting an ankle. The forest grew denser, and the sunlight barely penetrated the thick canopy. I began noticing signs that the trail was seldom traveled: broken branches, faint footprints that looked old, and a sense of quiet that was almost unnatural. The wind rustled the treetops, carrying a low, whispering sound that made me uneasy. I shook the feeling off, telling myself it was just the forest, nothing more. Around midday, I reached the top of the ridge. The view was stunning. Rolling hills stretched into the distance, cloaked in autumn colors, a mixture of gold, red, and brown. I paused to rest and take in the scenery, setting down my pack and sitting on a large rock. The beauty of the place made me feel small and alive all at once. I snapped a few photos with my phone and then started back down the trail, following what I thought was the marked path. It was around this time that I noticed something strange. The trail markings became inconsistent. Some were faded, almost invisible, while others seemed to contradict each other. I stopped and compared my GPS map with the surroundings, trying to reconcile the two. It was then that I realized I had taken a wrong turn somewhere along the ridge. My heart sank, but I reminded myself that I was prepared. I had backup maps, a compass, and enough food and water to last me several days if necessary. I decided to backtrack, returning to the last clear marking I could find. The forest around me felt heavier now, more oppressive. Shadows from the trees seemed darker, and every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves made me flinch. I kept my pace steady but cautious, constantly checking my compass and GPS. I was determined not to panic, but a nagging anxiety had started to creep in. By late afternoon, I realized that I had underestimated the difficulty of the terrain. The ridge slopes were steeper than they had appeared, and my legs ached more than I expected. I stumbled over rocks and roots, scraping my hands on bark and stone. The sun was lowering quickly, and I knew I needed to find a safe spot to rest before nightfall. The forest around me was vast and dense, and I began scanning for a clearing where I could set up a temporary camp. Eventually, I found a small plateau with enough flat ground to pitch my lightweight tarp. I gathered dry leaves and pine needles to create a soft sleeping area and secured my tarp between two sturdy trees. The setup was far from comfortable, but it would protect me from the wind and light rain. I ate a small meal from my pack, boiled some water, and tried to relax, but sleep did not come easily. Every snap of a twig, every distant rustle of the wind through the trees kept me on edge. During the night, I woke several times, convinced I heard footsteps or the low growl of some unseen animal. My flashlight illuminated nothing but trees and shadows. I realized that the forest at night was a different world entirely. Every sound was amplified, every movement suspicious. I reminded myself that I was alone, and that most wildlife would avoid humans if given the chance. Still, the tension was exhausting, and I fell back into a restless sleep by early morning. The next day, I resumed my hike. The cold had intensified, and frost covered the ground in patches. My legs were sore, my shoulders raw from the weight of the pack, but I pushed forward, relying on my compass and GPS to guide me. The trail was often indistinct, and I had to scramble over rocks and fallen trees, sometimes losing sight of the path entirely. Several times I considered turning back, but I knew that would mean retracing miles over treacherous terrain, which could be even more dangerous. By late afternoon, I had descended from the ridge and entered a denser part of the forest. The underbrush was thick, making progress slow and exhausting. I noticed broken branches in unusual patterns and deep tracks in the mud. Too large to be deer, too irregular to be a bear. I felt my stomach tighten with apprehension. I was not the first person to walk these woods, and I had the uneasy feeling that I might be being watched. My pace quickened, but I remained cautious, scanning the area constantly. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I knew I had to find shelter quickly. I spotted a shallow cave along the side of a hill, a rock overhang that provided some protection from the elements. I cleared debris and pine needles from the entrance and set up my tarp partially inside. It was cramped and uncomfortable, but it would keep me dry and shielded from the wind. That night, the sounds of the forest were even more intense. Branches snapping under the weight of unseen animals, the howl of distant coyotes, and the constant whisper of wind through the trees. I stayed alert, keeping my flashlight and small knife within reach, and slept in short, tense bursts. The following morning, I decided to take a calculated risk. My water supply was running low, and I needed to find a stream. I consulted my maps and headed downhill, moving carefully through thick vegetation and steep slopes. My boots slipped on wet rocks, and I had several near misses where I almost fell into ravines. Eventually, I found a small, clear stream and filled my water bottles. I drank greedily, feeling relief as the cool water ran down my throat. With renewed energy, I pressed on. The forest began to thin slightly, and I could see patches of sky above. The GPS indicated that a service road and trailhead were within a few kilometers, but the path was not straightforward. I had to navigate around dense thickets, fallen trees, and rocky outcrops. Several times, I lost sight of the trail completely, relying solely on my compass and memory of the map to guide me. By late afternoon, I stumbled into a small clearing that opened onto a gravel road. Relief flooded through me as I realized I was close to civilization. I followed the road cautiously, aware that vehicles might be rare and that I could still be isolated if no one passed by. After what felt like hours, I finally saw a small parked car up ahead and a man working on clearing branches from the roadside. I waved my arms and shouted, though my voice sounded weak from days of exertion. The man noticed me and came over, bringing a sense of safety I had not felt in days. I explained my situation in brief gestures, and he offered to drive me to the nearest ranger station. The ride was surreal. I felt the tension in my body start to dissolve, though my muscles ached and my mind remained hyper-aware from the days of constant vigilance. At the ranger station, I was able to rest properly, eat warm food, and rehydrate. The rangers checked my gear, took notes on my route, and reassured me that I had handled the situation as well as anyone could have. After a few hours of rest and recovery, I reflected on the experience. I had underestimated the difficulty of the terrain and the unpredictability of the wilderness, but I had survived through careful planning, endurance, and a constant awareness of my surroundings. The hike had been terrifying at times, pushing me to the limits of both my body and my mind, but it had also reminded me of my capacity to navigate danger and make rational decisions under pressure. In the days that followed, I returned home and rested, my body aching but my spirit invigorated. I reviewed my maps and notes from the hike, analyzing where I had gone wrong and how I could improve my preparation. I knew I had taken risks that could have been fatal, but I had survived because I stayed calm, assessed every situation, and never ignored warning signs. The memory of the dense forest, the hidden dangers, and the feeling of isolation remained vivid, a constant reminder of the respect the wilderness commands. That hike changed me. I became more disciplined in planning, more cautious in executing solo excursions, and more aware of the thin line between adventure and danger. Every time I walk through a familiar trail now, I carry the lessons of the White Pine Ridge with me. Respect for the land, attentiveness to detail, and the knowledge that preparation and persistence can see you through even the most frightening and uncertain moments. I had ventured into the unknown, faced real fear, and returned safely, with both a clearer understanding of the wilderness and a deeper confidence in my own resilience. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it through the trees, sweeping slowly. Nothing, just the shapes of trunks and undergrowth. Then I saw it. A faint outline, too large to be a deer, moving between the trees. I couldn't tell if it was human, but the size and the way it moved set off a wave of fear I hadn't expected. My first thought was to stay still to avoid drawing attention, but my mind screamed that staying in place could be just as dangerous. I gathered my gear quietly, slipping into my boots. I decided to leave the clearing, to move along the trail until I was far enough away that I could find another place to hide or a safer spot to rest. I put out the fire as carefully as I could, leaving only smoldering embers, and moved into the trees, using the darkness as cover. The sound of my own breathing seemed deafening, each step on twigs or dry leaves threatening to betray me. The outline I had seen didn't appear again, but I felt it, the awareness of being tracked, measured, observed. I kept moving along the ridge, trying to stay low and quiet. The trail was difficult in the dark, roots and rocks threatening to trip me at every step. I checked my map and compass repeatedly, careful not to get lost. I had no idea if the person or animal was still following, but the feeling never left me. Hours passed. My legs burned, my lungs ached, and the cold seeped into my bones. At some point, exhaustion forced me to stop, crouching behind a boulder, my pack still on my back. I listened. Silence. Absolute, heavy silence. I thought about staying there until sunrise, but I knew I couldn't. If there was a human presence, it could return at any time. I continued, moving as carefully as possible. The terrain gradually leveled out, and I began to recognize familiar features from my map. A small stream, a patch of rocks, a bend in the trail. By the first light of dawn, I reached a wider path, more traveled, with signs of other hikers. Relief washed over me, though I remained cautious. I stayed near the trail, moving steadily toward a ranger station marked on my map. The forest felt different in daylight, less threatening, but the memory of the night's events lingered. By late morning, I reached the ranger station. A couple of rangers were just starting their day. I explained my situation, how I had camped in a remote area and felt like I was being followed during the night. They listened carefully, asked questions, and noted the location I had camped. I felt an overwhelming sense of safety just being near people again, in a place where help was accessible. They told me that in this area, illegal hunting and trespassing sometimes happened, and my instincts to leave the clearing had probably saved me from an encounter with someone dangerous. I spent the next few hours with them, resting, drinking water, and sharing what I could of the terrain and markings I had seen. They explained some of the signs I had noticed, the scratch marks, the movement at night, and confirmed that it could have been human, perhaps someone illegally camping or hunting. I realized how close I had come to a situation I couldn't handle alone. Eventually, I made my way back down the trail with the rangers guiding me partway. I felt every step, aware now of both the beauty and the danger of the wilderness. By the time I reached my car, the sun was high, and the warmth of the day contrasted sharply with the cold, fear-filled night I had endured. I packed my gear, took a deep breath of the fresh mountain air, and drove back to civilization, shaken but unharmed. The hike had been one I would never forget. It reminded me of the rawness of nature, the isolation, and the unpredictability of human presence. I had gone out seeking adventure and challenge, and I had found them. But I had also found fear, caution, and respect for the wilderness in its most uncompromising form. I made a promise to myself. Never again would I underestimate how isolated and vulnerable I could be in the mountains. I had survived because I had stayed alert, trusted my instincts, and acted decisively when I felt danger. That night had been terrifying, but it ended with clarity, with the knowledge that I could navigate extreme fear and come out alive, wiser and more aware than I had been before. I had been planning this hike for months, tracing maps, reading trail reports, and checking the weather obsessively. I wanted a challenge, something that would push me further than my usual weekend trails. The area I chose was remote, a stretch of rugged mountains that few people attempted alone. The main trailhead was a 2-hour drive from the nearest town, a dirt road that became rougher the deeper I went into the forested hills. When I finally parked my car in the small gravel lot near the trailhead, the silence was immediate and complete. The usual background hum of cars, voices, or even distant planes didn't exist. Only the wind whispering through the pines and the occasional call of a bird broke the stillness. It felt good, even exhilarating, to be completely removed from civilization. But there was a subtle tension underneath that excitement, a sense that I was stepping into a place where very few people came and even fewer returned unchanged. I checked my pack one last time: water, snacks, first aid kit, map, compass, flashlight, extra batteries, and a small folding knife. I had gone over everything meticulously. I adjusted the straps and took a deep breath, trying to focus on the calm I felt when I was out in the wilderness. The first section of the trail was easy enough, a clear path of dirt and rock winding through thick pine forest. The sun was low, filtering through the trees in gold and orange streaks. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. I moved quickly, eager to cover some distance before nightfall, but I made sure not to tire myself out. As the afternoon passed, the trail began to change. It became narrower, less maintained, with roots and rocks jutting up like obstacles. I had to watch every step to avoid twisting an ankle. The forest grew denser, the light fading faster than I expected. I noticed something about the trees. Some had fresh scratch marks, deep enough to look deliberate. I paused, scanning the area. Could have been bears, but it could have been anything. A chill ran down my spine, but I told myself not to overthink it. Wildlife markings weren't unusual in a wilderness this remote. Eventually, I reached a small creek that ran across the path. The water was clear and cold, and I knelt to drink some, letting it wash over my hands and face. The sound of running water was comforting, a small reminder that life persisted even here. I looked upstream and noticed the terrain ahead rising steeply, a narrow ridge leading into higher elevations. I checked my watch. I had a few hours before dark, enough time to reach a small clearing I had spotted on the map where I intended to set up camp. The climb was harder than expected. Loose stones shifted under my boots, and the incline forced me to stop frequently to catch my breath. The sun was low now, shadows stretching long and sharp. I noticed a sudden quiet. The creek sounded further away, and even the occasional bird call had stopped. I paused, listening, and felt a faint unease creeping in. The wind had picked up, rustling through the trees in a way that made the forest seem alive, almost watching. I told myself it was nothing, that nerves were normal when hiking alone in unfamiliar territory. Finally, I reached the clearing. It wasn't large, maybe enough space for a small tent, but it had a flat surface and some dry ground. I dropped my pack, feeling the relief in my shoulders. Setting up camp took longer than I expected. My hands were shaking slightly from exhaustion, the cold, and the adrenaline. I pitched my small tent, arranged my sleeping bag inside, and gathered some dry branches for a fire. I had a small stove as well, but I wanted the warmth of an actual fire. As darkness fell, the forest transformed. The shadows between the trees thickened, and the sounds of the forest became sharper. Branches creaked and snapped under their own weight. The wind howled through narrow gaps in the ridge, and every rustle of leaves made me flinch. I lit the fire, the small flames casting flickering light across the clearing, and ate a simple meal of energy bars and trail mix. My hands were still trembling slightly, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I tried to tell myself it was paranoia. Even so, I kept my knife within reach, leaning it against a rock near the fire. Night settled fully, and the temperature dropped quickly. I wrapped myself in my sleeping bag and watched the fire, feeling the warmth on my face and hands. The forest beyond the glow of the flames was black, absolute and suffocating. I thought I heard movement out there, just at the edge of my vision, but when I turned my head, there was nothing. Every so often, a distant howl carried through the ridges. I assumed it was a coyote, though it was far too late for it to be hunting. Still, the sound was unnerving. Hours passed slowly. Sleep came in fits, broken by the noises of the forest and my own imagination running wild. Around 2 a.m., I woke to the sound of movement. Not the wind, not a distant animal call, but deliberate, calculated movement. I sat up, heart pounding, listening. The fire had died down to embers. The sound was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Something or someone was moving through the trees around the clearing. I froze, my mind racing through possibilities. A hiker? Unlikely, this area was rarely used. An animal? Maybe, but the steps sounded too careful, too precise. I had planned this hike for months, going over maps, reading reports from other hikers, and checking weather patterns carefully. The trail I chose was in a remote section of the northern wilderness, far from the popular routes, which meant I would see almost no one for miles. I liked the idea of isolation, of testing my limits and relying on nothing but my preparation and instincts. My backpack was heavy, but I had packed carefully: water, protein bars, a first aid kit, a small camping stove, a sleeping bag, and extra clothing. I had also packed a compass, a map, and a GPS device. I always told myself, being overprepared was better than risking being caught unprepared. The first part of the trail was familiar. I had hiked through similar terrain before. Tall pine trees lined the path, their needles thick and soft underfoot. The smell of earth and pine was strong. The sun was bright but filtered through the dense canopy. I felt energized, confident. My breathing was steady, and the rhythmic crunch of my boots on the forest floor was almost meditative. Birds called to one another, and I occasionally saw a squirrel dart across the trail, disappearing into the underbrush. By mid-morning, the trail began to climb sharply. I could feel my legs straining as the incline increased, my backpack pressing down on my shoulders. Sweat dampened my shirt, but I felt alive, the exertion making me feel present, sharp. The air grew cooler as I gained altitude, and the trees became sparser, replaced by rocks and patches of hard grass. I paused often, not just for water, but to take in the view. From certain vantage points, I could see the forest stretching endlessly below me, the small rivers and lakes glinting in the sunlight like pieces of glass. I felt a mix of awe and satisfaction. It was early afternoon when I noticed the first signs that something might not go as smoothly as planned. The trail became less distinct, a narrow path barely visible between rocks and underbrush. I checked my map, and it confirmed that this section was less traveled, rarely maintained. I considered turning back, but I had come far, and I wanted to reach the ridge where I planned to camp for the night. I pressed on, carefully placing my feet on stable surfaces. The ground was uneven, and loose rocks occasionally shifted under my weight. My pace slowed, but I felt competent. The isolation started to weigh on me subtly. There was no sound except the occasional wind through the pines and the distant call of a hawk. I reminded myself that I had done this before and could handle it. As the afternoon progressed, the terrain became more difficult. The path narrowed further, and steep drop-offs appeared on one side. I had to concentrate fully with each step, testing each rock and branch before trusting it. I noticed cracks forming in the larger rocks, probably from the freeze-thaw cycles in winter. One misstep could be dangerous. My heart began to beat faster, not from exertion alone, but from the awareness that the stakes had risen. I came to a particularly treacherous section, a narrow ledge along the side of a cliff. The drop was at least 50 feet, and the trail was barely wide enough for one boot at a time. My backpack shifted my center of gravity, making the climb even more dangerous. I moved slowly, placing my hands on the rough rock surface to stabilize myself. Halfway across, I noticed loose gravel under my foot. My heart jumped, and I froze, testing the ground carefully. Slowly, inch by inch, I edged forward, praying that the rock would hold. When I reached the other side, I exhaled deeply, feeling relief wash over me. My hands were scraped, and my knees shook from tension, but I had made it. I realized then how fragile my safety was in this wilderness. The isolation that had seemed so appealing earlier now felt threatening. I could see how easily things could go wrong. By late afternoon, I reached a small clearing. I decided this would be my campsite for the night. I had wanted to reach the ridge, but my body was exhausted, and I was aware of the sun sinking lower in the sky. I unpacked my gear and set up my tent as quickly as possible, aware that darkness would bring new challenges. The forest at night was a different world. Shadows stretched across the clearing, and the sounds of nocturnal creatures filled the air. I checked my gear again: water, food, stove, and first aid kit, making sure everything was within reach. I had my flashlight and headlamp ready, as well as spare batteries. Despite all the preparation, a subtle anxiety settled in. Being alone in this wilderness meant that any mistake could become serious. I had barely started to eat when I heard a loud rustling nearby. At first, I thought it was an animal, perhaps a deer or a raccoon. But the sound persisted, getting closer, louder. My stomach sank. I stayed still, listening carefully. The rustling stopped intermittently, as if the source was moving cautiously, almost deliberately. My mind raced. In situations like this, panic could be dangerous. I reminded myself to stay calm, to observe, and to think logically. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the area. I saw nothing but the dense shadows of trees. I considered that it might have been the wind moving branches, but the sound had been too deliberate, too rhythmic to be random. I kept my light steady, trying to detect movement. After what felt like an eternity, the sound receded, and the clearing returned to silence. My hands trembled slightly, and I focused on finishing my dinner quickly and securing the tent. I slept fitfully that night. Every sound, a branch cracking, a small animal rustling in the underbrush, jolted me awake. I realized that isolation changes the mind. It exaggerates ordinary noises into potential threats. I reminded myself repeatedly that I was prepared, that I had navigated difficult terrain before, that the wilderness was only dangerous if I made mistakes. Morning brought relief. The sun rose slowly, painting the trees in warm gold and orange tones. The air was crisp, and I felt more alert. I packed my tent and prepared to continue toward the ridge. The events of the previous evening weighed on me, but I was determined to complete the hike safely. The trail ahead was even steeper, rockier, and more uneven. I moved slowly, carefully placing my feet and testing every branch and stone. At one point, I had to climb a particularly steep section using my hands and feet. My muscles burned, and sweat poured down my back, but the exertion gave me a strange satisfaction. I was fully alive, completely dependent on my own skill and judgment. As I approached the ridge, I realized that the terrain had grown more unpredictable. Sections that looked solid were fragile, and loose stones could give way under my weight. I reminded myself to move cautiously and stay aware. At one point, I slipped slightly on a patch of moss-covered rock, but my hands caught the edge, and I held on tightly until my heartbeat slowed. Once I reached the ridge, I stopped to take in the view. It was breathtaking. Valleys stretching endlessly, rivers winding through the forests below, and mountains rising in the distance. But the beauty did not erase the tension of the past day. I felt a deep respect for the wilderness, for its quiet power, and for the thin line between safety and danger. I spent the night on the ridge, camping in a small, sheltered area. I made sure to secure my tent carefully, to keep my gear close, and to stay alert. I was more confident now, but I never let my guard down completely. The night was cold and quiet, and I slept in short intervals, waking frequently to check my surroundings. The following morning, I began the descent. Descending was often more dangerous than climbing, as gravity and fatigue made slips more likely. I took my time, moving carefully and testing each foothold. I paid close attention to the terrain and my own energy levels. Slowly, I made my way down, step by step, until I reached a more stable, wide trail that led back to the main path. As I walked the final miles back to the trailhead, I reflected on the experience. The fear I had felt was real and visceral, but it had sharpened my awareness and made me more careful, more attentive. I realized that hiking alone in remote wilderness was not about conquering nature, but about respecting it, understanding it, and preparing for every eventuality. By the time I reached my car, I was exhausted but exhilarated. The relief of seeing civilization again was immense. I had faced real danger, navigated treacherous terrain, and emerged safely. The experience left me with a profound respect for the wilderness and a clear understanding of my own limits. I packed up my gear, checked the car doors, and started the engine. As I drove away, I promised myself that I would return one day, better prepared, more skilled, but always respectful of the wild, and always aware that in nature, even small mistakes can have serious consequences. I had planned the hike for months, meticulously studying topographic maps, weather patterns, and trail reports. The mountain I chose was not a well-known trail. It was tucked away in a remote area, a place hikers often overlooked because it demanded respect and preparation. I liked the idea of being alone, of relying solely on my instincts and my physical endurance, but I knew that solitude came with risks. I packed carefully. A sturdy backpack with extra layers of clothing, a first aid kit, a compass, 2 liters of water, energy bars, a headlamp, a folding knife, and my phone. Even though I knew there might be no signal for hours, maybe even the whole day. I left a detailed note on my kitchen counter explaining my route and expected return time. I told myself that caution was part of adventure, not a hindrance to it. I set out just as the sun began to climb the sky. The air was crisp, the kind that filled your lungs with a sharpness that made you feel alive. My legs carried me steadily at first, along a trail barely wider than a deer path, littered with roots and fallen branches. I passed a small stream early in the morning. The water ran clear and cold over smooth stones, and I paused to cup some into my hands and drink. The trail gradually rose, the trees growing taller and denser, blocking the sunlight and casting long shadows across the narrow path. Birds flitted above, their calls piercing the silence. I remembered that this solitude would not last forever. The higher I climbed, the thinner the air would become, and the more careful I would need to be with every step. Around mid-morning, the trail became steeper and the undergrowth thicker. I had to navigate around fallen trees and muddy patches where the rain from the previous night had pooled. My boots sank slightly into the wet soil, making each step feel heavier. I felt a twinge of fatigue in my calves but pressed on. I kept glancing at the sun, measuring the time in my head, thinking about the return hike I had to make before nightfall. The mountain was deceptive. The summit looked closer than it really was. For hours, I climbed, alternating between steady steps and short, careful pauses to catch my breath and appreciate the view. As I reached a small ridge, I noticed something strange. Tracks in the dirt caught my eye, large, irregular footprints that weren't human. At first, I thought they might belong to a deer or some other wildlife, but the depth and width suggested something heavier, something that could be dangerous. I froze, scanning the trees on either side. The wind whispered through the branches, and for a brief moment, the forest seemed to hold its breath. I considered turning back, but a part of me, the part that had come here for the challenge, pushed forward. I made a mental note to remain alert, to watch for movement and listen closely for any sounds beyond the usual forest noises. By late morning, the trail narrowed further, hugging the side of a ridge with steep drop-offs. The ground was uneven, strewn with loose rocks that shifted underfoot. I had to balance carefully, planting each foot deliberately. One misstep here could be catastrophic. My heart raced a little, not from exertion but from the awareness of my vulnerability. I could hear the occasional rustle of leaves, the scurry of small animals, but nothing else. Yet the footprints stayed with me in the back of my mind. Every shadow looked like a figure, every sound amplified by my heightened attention. The forest, which had felt alive and inviting earlier, now seemed watchful, even hostile. Around noon, I reached a small plateau that offered a clear view of the valley below. I dropped my pack, sat on a flat rock, and pulled out my water bottle. The valley stretched out endlessly, a quilt of green and brown, the river glinting like a silver ribbon in the sunlight. I ate one of my energy bars slowly, savoring the quiet and the view, though my mind kept returning to the footprints. I tried to rationalize them. Maybe a bear had passed through earlier in the morning, but there was no scat, no other sign. It was just the deep impressions in the soil, heavy and fresh. I ran my fingers over the dirt, measuring the depth, the shape. Something about them felt off, unnatural. I finished my water and packed everything back, deciding I would keep moving, stick to the trail, and remain calm. The afternoon brought more challenges. The trail twisted into a dense forest, dark and silent except for the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. The slope grew sharper and the rocks became jagged. I had to use my hands for balance at times, pulling myself over boulders and along narrow ledges. The physical strain was intense, and sweat ran down my back despite the cool air. My arms ached from gripping tree roots. My legs trembled slightly from constant tension. I reminded myself to breathe deeply, to pace myself, to focus on one step at a time. Panic would only lead to mistakes here. The mountain demanded respect, and I was determined to meet its challenge. Suddenly, I heard a low growl, distant but unmistakable. My stomach tightened, and my pulse quickened. I froze mid-step, listening. The growl came again, closer this time, a slow, deliberate sound that made my skin prickle. I scanned the forest, my eyes straining to pick out movement between the dense trunks and underbrush. I knew instinctively that I could be facing a large predator. My mind went through everything I had learned about encounters with bears or mountain cats. Stay calm, avoid sudden movements, make yourself appear larger, don't run. I slowly reached for my knife, keeping it ready but concealed, knowing that any sudden move could trigger aggression. The growl faded as the animal moved along a different path, but the tension lingered. Every nerve in my body remained taut, alert, ready for anything. By late afternoon, I reached a rocky section where the trail became almost vertical. The sun was dipping lower, and shadows lengthened across the rocks. My muscles were sore, my energy dipping, and the water in my bottle was running low. I took frequent breaks, sitting on ledges and breathing heavily, feeling the burn in my thighs and calves. My hands were scraped from gripping rocks and branches, my boots coated in mud and dust. I realized that if I did not find a safe spot to rest and hydrate, I could face serious danger on the way down. I scanned the cliffside, looking for a small flat area to sit and assess my options. Eventually, I found a ledge wide enough for me to rest, shielded slightly by a large boulder. I sat down carefully, letting my legs dangle, and sipped the last of my water. While resting, I considered the possibility of turning back. The trail back was as treacherous as the path forward, maybe more so in the fading light. The thought of descending these jagged rocks with tired muscles and failing light was daunting. Yet I also knew that continuing forward, finding the summit and making it back safely, could offer a better sense of control. I chose to press onward, pacing myself carefully. Each step required meticulous attention, as a single misstep could result in a serious fall. The mountain seemed indifferent to my presence, a silent force that demanded humility and precision. I focused on the tactile sensations, the roughness of rock under my fingers, the way my boots gripped the uneven surfaces, the wind cooling my overheated skin. As I neared the summit, the trail became almost non-existent, reduced to narrow scrapes of dirt and rock. The ridge was sheer on one side, with a drop that would have been fatal if I slipped. I kept my center of gravity low, using every handhold I could find, feeling the coarse stone scrape against my palms. The air grew thinner, each breath sharper, more laborious. Sweat mixed with dust on my face, and the ache in my legs became a constant throb. I told myself that this was the part where many hikers misjudged the difficulty, where overconfidence or fatigue led to accidents. I remained vigilant, moving slowly and deliberately. Finally, after hours of careful climbing, I reached the summit. The view was staggering, worth every ounce of effort. I could see the river snaking through the valley, forests stretching endlessly, and distant mountains rising like silent sentinels. I sat down heavily, legs trembling from exertion but heart soaring with the accomplishment. I allowed myself a few minutes to absorb the landscape, to rest and hydrate from the remaining water in my bottle. I felt a deep sense of satisfaction, a mix of relief and exhilaration. But I knew the climb wasn't over. The descent could be even more dangerous than the ascent. I began the careful process of descending. My knees shook with every step. My fingers brushed constantly against rocks and roots for balance. Loose stones skittered underfoot, forcing me to stop frequently and reassess each movement. I encountered the same patch of dense forest where I had seen the strange footprints earlier. They were still there, faint but visible. I paused to study them, noting the depth and irregularity. The sight made my stomach churn, but I kept moving, staying as quiet as possible and focusing on the path ahead. Hours passed as I carefully made my way down, each section requiring full attention. The sun dipped below the horizon, and twilight spread across the forest, adding another layer of difficulty to navigation. By nightfall, I found myself in a small clearing where I could finally set my backpack down and catch my breath. My clothes were torn and caked with mud, my hands scraped, and my body trembling from exertion and cold. I checked my map and compass, plotting the shortest safe route back to the trailhead. I kept moving, descending through the forest cautiously, aware that darkness added a new level of danger. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, I reached the base of the mountain where the trail widened and flattened. Relief washed over me. The familiar terrain allowed me to pick up speed slightly, and I finally emerged onto the dirt road that led to my car. Sitting in the driver's seat, exhausted and covered in dirt and scratches, I reflected on the day. The hike had been more dangerous than I anticipated. The unknown footprints, the growls, the treacherous terrain, and the constant vigilance had tested my physical and mental limits. But I felt a profound sense of accomplishment. I had respected the mountain, moved cautiously, and survived without injury beyond minor scrapes. I drove home slowly, my body aching, my mind replaying every detail of the day. The hike had reminded me of the raw power of nature and the importance of preparation, awareness, and respect. It had been terrifying at moments, exhilarating at others, and ultimately, deeply rewarding. I knew that I would return one day, better prepared, with a deeper understanding of my limits and the mountain's demands. But for now, I simply sat in silence, grateful to have faced the challenge and returned safely.